How does something like this happen? People lose hope, Mr. Black. This is a generation of those who would rather revel in the idea of self-end than of bettering their lives. Yes, Mr. White, but this is almost the opposite. This is a clear desire to extend life, despite the life in question being terrible. Well, Mr. Black, all life has value, does it not? That's what your constituents keep pushing, isn't it? Don't talk triviality with me, Mr. White. You know that politics matter about as much as the score of last night's football game. Now, let the pocket politicians debate morality. These are matters of life and death. The only thing that really matters when you get down to it. Very true, Mr. Black. So then, let us speak of life and death, and of that strange gray realm that hangs between, the place where unlife begins. George was madder than he had ever been in his entire life. Not about the notice of eviction on his door. That was a triviality for another day. Besides, he couldn't leave the apartment anyway. George hadn't left his apartment in close to a month, and it was mostly due to his size. George had always been large, and not, as his mother claimed, because his bones were big. No. George was large because he liked to spend his evenings sitting in front of his computer, eating microwave pizzas, and arguing with his arch-nemesis. When he found that he could no longer fit through the door, he'd simply tipped the DoorDash guy to bring them in and leave them. Less time spending grocery shopping was more time spending fencing with his most hated rival and arch-nemesis, Geiger 3587. Calling him an arch-nemesis made it sound heroic. It wasn't just George, the former CPA at that point. He was George, the savior of man. What he saved them from was the bad omens of others, and he was the best at what he did. It had started on the Gundam subreddit. Geiger had some dated ideas about mobile suits, especially the Zaku models, and George had tried to educate on the folly of his opinions. He had tried to help him, but Geiger hadn't wanted help. Geiger wanted chaos. That was how it had started. And suddenly Geiger was following him to different anime subreddits, and his opinions were becoming more and more egregious. Dragon Ball Z, My Hero Academia, Demon Slayer. Even his beloved Chobits wasn't safe from the man and his terrible opinions. George had tried to be patient with him, tried to educate him, but the man would not see reason. He had the most backwards opinions, the worst takes imaginable, and constantly spouting nonsense that argued with the good sense George put forward. Then it left the anime subreddit. Soon it was all his comments, his posts, everything he did, or everywhere that he enjoyed. That was when Geiger 3587 became more than just an annoyance. He became his nemesis. George started losing sleep. He was either arguing with the man's newest point, or formulating imaginary arguments to his coming points. He started seeing his work suffer as he answered comments at his desk. The few friends that he had were left on red in favor of arguments online, and the seething anger within George began to grow. Then, one day, after George had done nothing for 6 hours but angrily tap on his phone, his boss came into his office and told him that his services were no longer needed. His PTO and sick days were cashed out, but his boss wasn't a bad guy. George had been a valued employee for nearly a decade, and he offered him severance, 1 week for every year of employment. That had stopped a week ago, and George was nearly out of unemployment too. He didn't care though. His life had begun to revolve around this hateful little man and his constant validation of everything he held dear. Now, George didn't get up unless he had to, typing away and arguing night and day. He hadn't noticed the oily, translucent discharge that had begun to slide from him. He didn't care. Didn't even notice the snail trail that he had left from his apartment to the kitchen, and the hotter his hate burned, the more sludge poured from him. The neighbors beneath him had complained about the wet spots on the ceiling, The neighbors beside him had complained about the stains on the shared walls that were slowly seeping through, and maintenance was finally forced to go investigate. What they found was beyond what even they suspected. "Think he's dead?" Marcus asked casually, texting his girl as he leaned against the wall beside the door to 317. The eviction notice was hard to miss, and it was a wonder that they hadn't already been asked to go in and check on the guy already. Another week, and they would probably be breaking down his door anyway. "Let's hope not, kid," said Gordon as he checked the keys on his ring. "Have you ever smelled the body once it started going soft?" "No," Marcus said, and Gordon, Doc to everyone here, could have figured as much. Marcus looked like he hadn't even had to shave more than once a week until last year, and he wasn't sure what McElvey thought that he could teach this kid about maintenance work. The kid was on his damn phone more than anything, and he was about ready to slap it out of his hand. "Well, I have, and it ain't nothing you want. It's worse if you don't catch them early. The smell sticks with you for a while, gets into your nose, and just sorta... Aha!" he said, finding the right key and sliding it into the lock. "Should we knock again?" asked Marcus, putting his phone away as Doc made ready to open the door. "We've hammered on the damn thing for nearly 20 minutes. If he hasn't come by now, then I doubt that he's coming." And the door popped open and Doc winced as it hit on the chain. Of course, the guy had the chain up. Now they would have to get the pry bar and break in, and very likely, Mr. Garvey had gotten too fat to get out of bed, and they would get an earful. And then Mr. McElvey would... "Doc, what is that?" Marcus said, and Doc looked down to see some kind of sludge oozing out of the crack in the door. "Dunno," Doc said, bending down to take a look. It was weird, like mucus or something. It was seeping out of the apartment, trickling into the hallway through the ajar door, and Doc was mesmerized by it. He reached a finger down, wanting to touch it, but thought better of it when the stuff seemed to lunge upward towards him. Doc scrambled back, no longer so curious, but Marcus hadn't seen. "What's up, Doc? The slime got ya?" But he had stepped too close. The liquid flowed up and over his sneaker, and Marcus shuddered like a pane of glass. He went rigid, his arms and legs locked up, and Doc watched as the color of his skin went from light brown to a lint ball gray. He shrank, sort of sinking into himself, and Doc gasped as he melted into himself and just oozed into the collective slime on the floor. Doc almost sat there for far too long, the ooze continuing to slide out of the door. It was creeping up on him, getting closer and closer, and Doc rolled out of the way as he saw it getting closer and closer to having him too. He got up on his feet and he ran for McElvey's office, and left the door to apartment 317 open, an ooze freeing to escape. It was 11:15 when Doc ran off, and when Mrs. Folsom came back from walking her dog at 11:30, the ooze had spread. Mrs. Deborah Folsom had lived in the apartment for the last 20 years. Her rent was controlled by Mr. McElvey, the building super. She owed him quite a bit. Without Mr. McElvey, Mrs. Folsom would have been out on the street. Her pension was no good, her retirement from Green Grocers having been hit hard in 2012, and she thanked Mr. Obama for it, often in tones of deepest sarcasm. As it stood, she had just enough money to buy groceries, pay rent, and buy her medication. If she was careful and she saved her pennies, she could afford a few Christmas presents for her granddaughter every year. But if they raised the price of food much more, she wouldn't even be able to do that. When Ellie started to bark at something, it pulled her out of her thoughts and back to reality. Mrs. Folsom lived in 319, so her path took her right past 317. She could see the door open and some kind of liquid coming through the gap. She thought at first that it might be water, but the longer that she looked at it, the thicker that it looked. It was like clear sludge or the ice that you see on the top of ponds in winter. Ellie wouldn't go near it, barking her little Pomeranian lungs out from further down the hall, and she made a strange noise when Mrs. Folsom bent down to look at the stuff. "Oh, Ellie, what are you so afraid of? It's just a little..." But she put her hand down to touch it, and went rigid as her finger came in contact with the liquid. Allie went back down the hall, her lead trailing behind her as the ooze kept running from the door.
Recorded call between Mr. McElvey, the superintendent of Pine Forest Apartments, and Ms. Shannon Elroy of 312 at 1:13 p.m. on Tuesday, March 3rd, 2024.
McElvey, Pine Forest Apartments. Mr. McElvey speaking.
Mr. McElvey, it's Ms. Elroy on 3. There's something in the hallway that I think needs attention.
Good afternoon, Ms. Elroy. Something in the hallway, you said? Is it a broken water pipe or something?
No, I think that it's some kind of coolant or something. I'm more worried about my boyfriend.
Tom? Is he okay?
He went out to check on it and never came back. I went to get the phone, and when I came back, he was nowhere to be found. Now it's running under my door, and I'm not sure what it is.
Have you called maintenance? I remember sending Doc and Marcus up there a while ago to check on something.
I did, but no one answered. It's...
Ms. Elroy? Ms. Elroy, is everything okay? Surely you jest. You're telling me that this whole incident was begun because some schlub got in a fight with some other schlub? Why does that surprise you, Mr. White? After all, wars have been fought because one person disagreed with another. Fingers have hovered over the launch controls for nuclear weapons, something that would mean assured destruction, because a plane left its intended flight path or a weather balloon got lost from its moorings. Even so, Mr. Block, you have to realize how fantastical this is. This George Garvey turned into a creature of pure hate because of an argument about what? Animation? Pictures? The exchange of ideas, Mr. White, is very important, as is the right to argue those facts. What would any forum be without discontent? Discontent or not, I wonder if this Geiger fella knows what he's done. Very likely not, though if he knew that it was him, he would be likely to make it known. You think so, Mr. Block? These kind of basement dwellers need to crow when they've made a kill that transfers into the world. George was angrier than he had ever been. This idiot, this fool, he just wouldn't let up. He thought he knew everything. Fucking everything. If George felt the slime as it slid off and onto the keyboard, then he ignored it. He had been embroiled in a vicious argument with Geiger for the last several hours. Hours, or was it just days? George couldn't remember. But he didn't remember eating much in the time. He vaguely remembered cooking a pizza, but he didn't know how long that had been. He didn't remember going to the bathroom either. But he supposed that he would eat and drink and go to the toilet when he needed to. His computer dinged and he looked up and into a fresh burst of fury. These idiots needed to face facts, and George would be his teacher today. If George had been capable of seeing anything but his own screen, he would have noticed the rising tide of translucent slime around him. The room was half full, covering everything in a membrane of goo, and whether the conversations were real or just in his mind, no one could say. Surely the computer, the one sitting under the 2 feet of slime, couldn't still work. But George kept on furiously typing away as he proved his point to his arch-nemesis. George's apartment was now a swiftly growing bog of sludge, the door crack having opened wide after the push of all the fluid had broken the chain. The room on the 3rd floor of the Pine Forest apartment was now empty of everything besides slime and the residents' furniture. The slime seemed like nothing so much as the energy exerting by living beings, their anger, their fear, and the kinetic force that dwelt within them. The slime spread as he consumed them, this living mucus that erupted from the body of George Garvey and consumed everything in its path. It had already eaten the roaches in the walls, a few mice that scurried behind the baseboard, and even the fleas that had been left behind by Mrs. Folson's dog, Ellie, as she scampered away. They were okay. The energy he needed, but they weren't like the others. They were the suspicion and machismo he had gotten from Marcus. They weren't the worry and the fear of impending death that he'd gotten from Mrs. Folson. They weren't the barely contained lust, the secret shame, and the desire for more that he had gotten from Mrs. Elroy and Thomas. That reservoir was running low now, and George would need to replenish it, as he meant to continue his war on Geiger and his stupid array of dumb opinions.
"We're ready to expand,"
said a slippery something in the back of his mind.
"Just say the word."
George didn't need to say anything. He knew that they would move whether he willed it or not. Fortunately for him, he willed it.
Excuse me, sir. I just need to...
Move along, ma'am. There's been a gas leak in there, and we need everyone away from the doors. The old woman hurried off, and the man in the coveralls watched her closely from behind her sunglasses. This was bad. They had to figure out what was going on before it was too late. They had to gather a reading from the area around noon and had been gathering data and keeping people out since. The syndicate needed this under wraps before anyone would realize what was going on. And there was a lot going on. They could evaluate the remaining residents, at least the ones on the floor below 3, but they could already be contaminated. If any of this spread, it would be a disaster on an epic scale. They hadn't had a plasmodic reading like this since the early 2000s, and that was not something that they wanted to be repeated. Mr. Black had been very clear on that.
Anything,
he said on the earpiece. Nothing concrete, but it's growing. It's already too big to contain. With any luck, it will run out of food and die. But that will take a while, and we just don't know what kind of growing patterns to expect in the meantime. He acknowledged, and he went back to his post. He had to be vigilant. At least something slipped past. Mr. McElvey lumbered up the stairs on his ponderous, gouty legs. Where was Doc? Where was Marcus? He had full-blown emergency and on his hands, and they were nowhere to be found. Damn, these stairs were murder. But he had to get up to the 3rd floor. The man out front had told him that there was an emergency, put a damn gun at his face when he tried to press the matter, and told him that he had to get back inside for his own safety. McElvey wondered if the emergency had anything to do with what was going on here, but he had put that past his mind. How could it? There was nothing going on here. Just lazy tenants and rusty pipes. Same as always. McElvey stopped as he got to the top of the stairs, wondering if it wasn't a little more than that as he saw the bulging door that opened onto the 3rd floor. When he was younger, back when his legs had worked right, he had left a can of Coke in the back seat of his T-Bird. Thankfully, he had found it before it burst all over the custom leather seats, but it had popped like a pimple when he tossed it into the nearby parking lot. The door looked like that, an overripe pimple just waiting to pop. McElvey reached for it, closing his hands around the handle, but something told him not to pull. It was a little voice that told him to buy scratchers sometimes, the voice that told him to check the camera before he just buzzed someone in late at night, to keep on the street instead of taking a shortcut. He started to let go. He started steeling himself just this time, wanting to see what all the fuss was about. And the door sprang open, and McElvey was disintegrated into nothing before he hit the stairs. His last thought was a lament that he hadn't heeded the voice. He should have gone to lunch when it told him to leave at 11:30. He should have left the door alone, and, above all else, he should have never gotten out of his bed on the 5th floor this morning. Marion McCormick opened her eyes as the building shook on its foundation. She looked at the clock and saw that it was almost 3:30. The alarm wasn't set to go off until 4, the time that she usually woke up so she could do a round a little before her shift at 11 at the Texaco. But she sighed and she realized that it just wasn't going to happen. Whatever, she thought. It was only 30 minutes. What was a half hour in the grand scheme of things? Marion was showering, her toothpaste secure in her mouth, as she applied shampoo when the power suddenly went out. This was a bigger deal than it should have been because the bathroom had no windows, and she was suddenly plunged into darkness. The water went cold too as she washed her hair quickly, and then narrowed to a trickle as she tried to get all the soap off. Well, shit, she said, spitting her toothbrush into the tub and fumbling for a towel. What fresh hell was this? She got dressed into something simple, jeans and a t-shirt, and was just slipping on her sandals when she heard the commotion in the hallway. She slipped her hair into a wet tail, something that she would never have done outside of an emergency, and stuck her head out the front door. People were running up the hallway, making their way into the stairwell, and she could see a little collection of them looking down into the darkness. The emergency lights were on, and they might as well all have been candles in the dark hallway. Marion walked down to see what all the ruckus was about and was glad to see that John was leaning against the rail and staring down as well. John was about 12 years older than her, but she still held some of the youthful embrace that she did at 25. He was a mechanic or something. His thick arms seemed to be constantly dark with grease, and his little beard reminded her of the guys on Game of Thrones. He was dressed in coveralls and boots, and his wide shoulders were visible even in the gloom. She would not have objected to have those strong arms around her, and while 35 still seemed ancient to Marion, if she got to age as gracefully as John had, she guessed it wouldn't be too bad. "Hey, Mary," he said, and she laughed as she came to stand beside him. It was always funny how he did that. "What you looking at?" she asked him, staring down before feeling a gasp stick in her throat. Rising slowly was a shimmering something, the water a sludge, shimmering like stars as it came up the stairwell. It looked like a snow globe full of stars, and whole galaxies seemed to exist within the swirling void. It was lovely, but Marion knew that it would be deadly if it kept rising. "I don't know," John said, "but it don't look good." It was near the 4th floor landing now. There was something on the landing as they watched it rise. Mr. Costin was wheelchair-bound, and he was looking up the stairs with no real concern. He was an ancient, shriveled husk, and it appeared that no one wanted to go down and risk getting stuck in the rising tide as they brought him up. Marion wanted to ask John why they didn't go get him, but they didn't know each other quite that well. John was just someone she stood outside and smoked with sometimes, someone that she waved to when they came in at the same time, and someone she, sometimes, thought about in the quiet hours of the night. She didn't like to think that he was a brute, but he might not be a nice guy either. As the swirling star mass came higher, someone finally ran down the stairs to try and get Mr. Costin. It was Raphael. The kid was from 517, and he took the stairs 2 at a time as he hurried. Raph would get him. He was on the football team at Marietta High, and he would lift the old man as easily as a sack of grain. Mr. Costin was saying something, probably telling the kid not to bother, but Raph lifted him easily and got him seated on his bag like the world's oldest backpack. He had taken only a single step up the stairs when the rising tide came up and over the ankle, freezing him in place. He looked like a store mannequin, his arms frozen in place, and when he fell back in, it was hard not to notice the foot was just sort of gone. Mr. Costin yelled as he fell right along with the kid, and the two hit the water without a splash or a ripple. They sunk like rocks, but not for long. Before they came anywhere near the floor, they were both swirling mounds of stars and dust. His mother cried out of anguish and surprise, but John stepped away from the rail and started running up the hall towards his apartment. Marion, giving one last look at the rising tide, ran with him.
"Have you heard the reports, Mr. Black? Did they find this Geiger person? If we can bring him in, maybe we can stop this before it gets out of control."
"No, but they did find a small town in Louisiana with a big problem."
"I don't have time for your riddles, Mr. White. Tell me what they have found."
"It's a little town, Mr. Black. A little town called Mobisville. At least, it used to be a town. It now appears to be a ghost town, encased in liquid gelatin. The people, quite gone." John went past the door to his apartment and came hurling down the hall towards the emergency stairwell. "Where are you going?" Marion asked, not sure that there was a we yet, but curious.
"To the roof," he said. "If they attempt to rescue people, it'll be from there."
Marion nodded, and that made sense. The roof was where people always got rescued in movies. If they made it to the roof, they would be safe. There would be a helicopter or something up there that could get them out of here, and they would be safe. She thought about stopping to get her cell phone, but decided against it. The tide was rising, and they needed to get to higher ground. They had come to the opposite stairwell, the one that led to the roof, when the screams from down the hall reached them. No mystery why, she thought as they came to the stairs. The stuff was coming up and over the topmost stair, and She was only a couple of steps when she heard the screams end way too abruptly. She didn't like the sound of that, but she kept climbing. She needed to get up there, needed to get out of this, and the roof was the best way to do it. "Come on!" John yelled, his voice frantic but still concerned. Marion looked down and then immediately wished that she hadn't. The tide was coming in quick now, chasing them up the stairs as they ran for the roof access. What would they do if the door was locked? What would they do if they got stuck against the door as the tide rose up to cover them? But Marion didn't have to worry long. The sun fell across her and the door opened and she was running out and into the sun as John looked around frantically for helicopters or some way down. There were people on the streets. She could see them from the lip of the roof, and they had cordoned off the building with tape. Did they know what was happening here? Did they have a clue? Marion didn't even really know what was happening, but when John cursed loudly, she turned to see the goo coming through the door and inching towards them. The concrete roof had stopped it, but the door was still allowing it through. "Come on," he said, taking her hand and leading her away from the door. "There's a fire escape that we can use to get to the ground." "What if it's coming through the windows too?" Marion asked, glancing behind her back towards the slowly creeping slime. "It's either the goo, the ladder, or we learn to fly," he said, and Marion nodded as she stepped into the fire escape. Marion couldn't help but look at the windows as they passed, and what she saw amazed her as much as it horrified her. Inside the apartments, there was nothing but furniture and random objects. The objects floating haphazardly through the slime, but the furniture seemed to be too heavy to go anywhere else. It was weird to see, but John had taken a hold of her hand, and it made it a little easier. She concentrated more on the calloused hand wrapped around hers, and that worked until they came to the third-floor window. They were going right past it, just one more step on the way to the ground. But when she saw the thing, it stopped her in her tracks. Marion supposed that it could have been a large doll or something, but as its arms moved, she guessed that it must have been a person. It was a dark shadow in the ooze, more bones than meat anymore, and as she stopped, turned its head towards her. Its eyes and brain were floating in the goo, the teeth gone right along with the skin. And as it turned back, she saw little cracks appearing in the glass. Whatever was in there was trying to get out, to get her. And when John pulled her, she went.
"Hands! Let me see your hands!"
The male raised both his hands and the woman's, but it appeared that neither of them were armed. Agent Yen held his weapon at them, his fellows following suit. They were the only people that they had seen come out of the apartment complex, and they were the only ones that they expected to see. The intrusion rate had reached 100%, but for some reason, it couldn't come up and over the lip of the roof. It was stuck inside the apartment. Hopefully, if it started coming out and onto the street, Agent Yen was not going to stick around to test how far it would go. They came down the final ladder and were cuffed, and then finally taken to decontamination. The male was struggling a little, but that was to be expected. He looked like the struggling type, and couldn't be seen to go down without a fight, especially if she was with him. They would be decontaminated, questioned, assessed, and released after the scan and scrub. It was a little sad, but maybe they would find each other again before it was all over. And sometimes, they did.
"Are you telling me that there are two of these things, Mr. White?"
"I am, Mr. Black. And what's more, it's moving."
"How is that possible?"
"They cannot travel more than a set amount of distance from the epicenter. How is
Mr.
it?"
Black,
"It's gaining mana from somewhere else. And I think that it has discovered a repository of hate more delicious than any human body."
this is unthinkable. We must alert Mr. Gray. This is...
In due time, Mr. Black. In due time.